In the next few minutes, I will use actual science to prove that you have not given up on your dreams. Maybe you've just hit a plateau where every option you think you have seems to be leading you back to where you've already been. What I'm about to share with you debunked a world-renowned psychology study. The doctor who carried out the study in 1967 came back 50 years later and corrected his own work. If you stay with me, your ability to follow through on the things you say you want could improve dramatically with this one tweak. Look, dog, if you are always stalling on your own ideas, contrary to popular opinion, you don't have a discipline issue. You ain't lazy. I'm Tijuana Jackson. I help people understand why they follow through, keep breaking down, and what to do next. I host a live 90-minute workshop where Romani Malco and I help you identify what's interfering with your follow-through so you can move your ideas forward with the level of commitment that you've never had before. You trying to get that work? Link is in the description. In 1967, a psychologist named Martin Seligman and his research partner Steven Maier ran an experiment on dogs. 3 groups. The first group got electric shocks but could stop it by pressing a button. Second group got the exact same shocks, same intensity, same timing, but they button didn't do nothing. No matter what they pressed, they kept getting shocked. The third group got no shocks at all. Next day, all 3 groups got put in a new situation, a box with a low wall. This time the shocks came through the floor, and all they had to do was jump over a low wall to get out and escape the shocks. First group figured it out quick. The third group figured it out quick, but the second group, the middle group, whose button never worked, most of them laid down, cowered and whimpered, taking more shocks. All they had to do was hop over this little wall to achieve freedom, and they chose captivity. That's like your boys inviting you to a strip club and you asking if your wife can come. Oh yeah, sure. Sit your cock block in front of your cock hopper. Made no sense. So at first, they removed the barriers and just called the dogs, trying to coax them across. This alone was not enough for this specific group of dogs. Then they attached leashes and physically pulled the dogs across the shuttle box, forcing them to experience the escape. And at first, it took a lot of force. They did it over and over, and the more they did it, the less force they had to use to get the dogs out them cages. And after a while, all it took was a slight nudge to get the dogs to walk out of the shock box. Then eventually, each dog initiated their own escape. A key takeaway was the threats, rewards, and even seeing other dogs escape the cages had no effect on this particular group of dogs. The dogs had to be physically forced to experience the escape at least twice before they would start doing it on their own. Seligman and his research partner looked at that and called it learned helplessness. He said these dogs learned that their actions don't matter, so they chose not to try. And that learned helplessness theory became one of the most influential ideas in 20th century psychology. It shaped how we think about depression, deprivation, poverty, motivation, all of it. It gave the world scientific permission to look at anybody who was stuck and say, well, they learned to be that way. They were shaped by their environment. The study gave your mama license to call you lazy, unfocused, gave your peers and mentors permission to say you just don't want it bad enough or that you was comfortable being a broke ninja. Let's take it one step further. This study helped reaffirm the pull yourself up by your bootstrap rhetoric. We showed you the dough. We can't make you walk through it. Look at the black community back in the day compared to now. The one that gets me is when folks be like, these younger generations is lost. Keep in mind, these old heads is talking about their own cheering, like it ain't their responsibility to provide the compass. I digress. But for years, this concept of learned helplessness was the accepted truth. If you stayed in bad situations, if you kept going back to what was killing you, the diagnosis was simple. Learned helplessness. You learned to stop trying. And the prescription was even simpler. Just try harder. Just believe. Just jump. Take a leap of faith. But that's not really what's happening inside the brain of the dog who's getting his nuts electrocuted. Nor was it what was really happening inside the brain of the person still stuck in an abusive relationship. 50 years later, in 2016, Dr. Maier came back. Same dude from the original study. But this time, he ain't a psychology student no more. He's a neuroscientist. And he said something that should have made front page news, but of course it didn't. He said he had it backward. The whole thing took him 50 years to realize it. The dogs didn't learn to be helpless. Helplessness was already there. That's the brain's factory setting. Your brain comes out the box like that. When you are under stress, that you cannot control, a part of your brain called the dorsal raphe nucleus floods your system with serotonin and shuts down your ability to act. You don't choose to lay down. Your biology lays you down. Same way you don't choose to flinch when somebody throws something towards your face. Your body decides to move before your mind ever clocks the threat. You ever been confronted by somebody and you knew exactly what you should have said, but you froze? 2 hours later in the shower, you delivering the closing argument like Johnny Cochran with conditioner in your hair. That's the same system. Your brain decided this moment is too much and pulled the plug on your mouth. So what Maier actually found is that the dogs who refused to leave the shock cages wasn't making a conscious decision. The dog's neurological system was overriding the dog's consciousness. Their behavior wasn't a reaction. The dogs who jumped the wall and got away from the shocks, they wasn't braver, they wasn't stronger, they wasn't more motivated. They had one thing the other dogs didn't: prior experience. They had confirmation through lived experience that choosing to press the button would actually stop the shocks. So their brain learned, oh, what I do can change what happens to me. And that one lesson rewired everything. The logical part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, lit up and told the panic system in the brain, the amygdala, to sit your ass down, we got this. Even in brand new situations they had never seen before, those dogs moved like they had options because their brain had been updated with one piece of software the other dogs never got installed. And that piece of software convinced them that in stressful situations, they still had options. They still had control. Not control over the world, but control over the belief that what they do can change their circumstances. And here's the part that made me uncomfortable. The dogs who never got that experience, the dogs with the button that didn't work, no amount of treats, no amount of encouragement, nothing could entice them to exit their state of suffering in that cage. They had to be physically dragged into freedom before they believed that better alternatives existed for them. Sound familiar? How many times somebody showed you the answer and you still couldn't move? That ain't laziness. That's a brain that never got a software update. You running Windows 95 in a 5G world wondering why nothing loading. It's cause you still buffering fear. Now would be a good time to hit that like button if you like something, and if you motivated as hell, hit that notification bell. But if you really want to see this channel grow, you are my algorithm, so please share this with your folks. Buzz. To be clear, most of us ain't choosing to be stuck. We not consciously choosing to sleep on our dreams and creativity. That shutdown, that failure to follow through is actually a neurological reflex. Your dorsal raphe nucleus floods your system with serotonin and shuts you down before you even have a say. That shit automatic like presidential elections. You don't really get a vote, but you still feel responsible for the outcome. And what happens after that shutdown is where you start making self-sabotaging choices. Because now you gotta explain to yourself why you ain't moved. You gotta cope with the emotional discomfort of failing to follow through, the shame of feeling unsatisfied with your own life. And the story you tell yourself is where the real damage gets done. The reflex lasts milliseconds. The narrative you build around it lasts decades. Type bars in the comments if you get that. I hope this helps you understand how you turn your body's biological responses into a conscious and personal response and the long-term damage it causes you. In 1978, 3 researchers figured it out. It was Abramson, Seligman, and Teasdale called it attributional style, which is just a fancy way of saying the bullshit you tell yourself has a pattern, and that pattern will fuck you up. They broke it into 3 questions your brain asks every time you fail to act, every time you fail to follow through, or every time you sleep on your mission. Number 1, is this permanent or temporary? Number 2, is this everywhere, just here? Number 3, is this me or the situation? Most people answer all 3 wrong. And here's what happens when you answer wrong to all 3 of them questions. That stuckness don't stay in one lane. It metastasizes, infects your money, your relationships, your health, your purpose. You start identifying as the cage instead of recognizing the cage is something you in temporarily. And now you decorating the cell, picking out curtains for a prison you could walk out of. That's like putting a welcome mat in front of a trap house. Buzz! Raise your hand if you black and been told you got an anger problem. Dr. Robert T. Carter at Columbia spent 20 years proving the anger diagnosis wrong. He called it race-based traumatic stress. And he made a distinction that should be required reading, but it ain't. He said racial trauma produces an emotional injury, not a disorder, an injury. That's not semantics. That's the difference between being told you broken versus being told you wounded. One assumes you defective from the factory. The other assumes you've been through something. But we ain't fixing to do this convenient cognitive dissonance bullshit on TJ Watch. You should know by now you can't gaslight a nigga that run on diesel. Do you remember the feeling of when you would walk into a room and immediately start scanning for facial expressions, energy shifts, shady niggas, etc.? The way you flinch when somebody reach for something too fast? The way you go quiet when the energy gets strange? That's a nervous system doing exactly what it's designed to do under repeated stress with no stop button. You ain't malfunctioning. Your body is responding. And though the shocks may have stopped coming, that wounded part of you didn't get that memo. The narrative you build around your anger, your shortcomings, your failure to go after what you want becomes your code. And that code ain't been upgraded since the 6th, 7th grade. That's why you still flinching at your ex's ringtone 2 relationships later. Most of us end up stuck because the 2 things working against us. 1, a reflex that shuts you down before you can think. And 2, a narrative that explains why staying down makes sense. One is biology, the other is biography. And most of us got hit with both barrels before we was old enough to spell our own name. That ain't an excuse. That's a diagnosis, and the prescription ain't discipline. The prescription is awareness. Because you can't uninstall what you don't know is running. Pause. Now let's piss off some black folks. What if I told you the survival skills your ancestors and elders needed are the same ones keeping you broke, keeping you hurt, and keeping you stuck? Dr. Joy DeGrasse spent years documenting what she calls post-traumatic slave syndrome, and her framework ain't theory. She showed how centuries of slavery followed by systemic oppression created adaptive behaviors that got passed down generation to generation. And some of those behaviors built resilience. Some of them built dysfunction. But here's what hit different. The behaviors that once kept your great-great-grandparents alive are the same behaviors keeping you stuck today. That ain't a character flaw. You got the survival code without the user manual. And nobody told you that the threat level changed. That's how most of us have learned to speak, think, and live in extremes. Here go the irony. Most of us have been groomed and conditioned to survive our parents and our elders' past rather than being groomed and conditioned to survive our futures. Type bars in the comments if you get that. So much of what we consider culture is really a byproduct of extreme dysfunction. Yet we spend our lives being measured, assessed, and diagnosed as if we started at the same starting line as everybody else. Dr. Naeem Akbar at Florida A&M called it out a decade ago. He pointed out how the entire diagnostic framework used to evaluate black behavior was built to maintain intellectual oppression. Translation: the very system being used to determine what's normal and what's abnormal in psychology was created by white academics who built it around white behavior as the standard. When black people get evaluated using that same system, they automatically look deficient. Not because something is actually wrong with them, but because the measuring stick was never designed to measure them fairly. It's like being judged on a test where the answers was written by people who never lived your experience, never faced your obstacles, and had a vested interest in you failing. The diagnostic labels such as lazy, aggressive, oppositional, hyperreactive, unmotivated, they was created to explain why black people don't fit into a system that was designed without them in mind. Akbar's point is the entire framework is rigged. So when you label yourself unfocused, undisciplined, or unmotivated, understand that that label came from a playbook and a perspective that was never meant to help you win. It was meant to justify your shortcomings and explain why you deserve to lose. That's like asking the pastor to grade the morals of his teenage side piece. Here's what nobody tells black folks about being strong. Dr. Rita Walker at University of Houston calls it psychological fortitude. Shit should be on a t-shirt, but it probably won't sell. God knows mine don't. The belief that we can endure anything is both a strength and a weakness of our current culture. Dr. Rita Walker, ladies and gentlemen. Translation: the same toughness that got our people through 400 years of hell is the same toughness that won't let you sit down long enough to heal. That's a bar, nigga. That's a bar. That's a motherfucking bar. We got so good at surviving that we pass down these survival skills to our children as life necessities. Nah, them is survival skills. Life, living, thriving takes a whole different set of skills. One is for maintaining and accepting whatever you've been given. The other is for optimizing and taking what the you won't. This changed the way I see things forever. Reesma Medicam wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands, and he said something that connected everything. He said, racialized trauma don't just live in your mind, it lives in your body. That shutdown you feel when opportunity knocks, that ain't fear. That's your nervous system running a program your grandmother installed before you was born. And the only way to uninstall it is to acknowledge it's there in the first place. You can't delete a file your hard drive can't even detect. Y'all got time for a joke? 2 black women walked into a research lab and walked out that bitch with peer-reviewed data confirming that racism ain't just in your head, it's in your nervous system. Dr. Ijama Madubata and Dr. Rita Walker ran a study on 172 black adults. And what they found should have been breaking news, but of course it ain't gonna be. They proved that a consistent dose of racial discrimination will lead you into depression. But before you reach depression, you gonna experience helplessness first. So racial discrimination is one thing. It triggers helplessness. And the helplessness leads to depression. That's the sequence. 37% of the people in that study had significant depression symptoms. That's damn near 4 out of every 10. The discrimination don't break you directly. It activates that default shutdown we've been talking about. The same dorsal raphy nucleus flooding your system and laying you down before you even get a vote. And if nobody ever taught you how to override that reflex, how to learn control, that helplessness becomes a pipeline straight to depression. Same conclusion Dr. Maier reached 50 years after his experiment. Helplessness is the biological default, but control gotta be installed. Ain't it crazy how intellect can bring 2 black women and a white man to the same conclusion over 50 years apart? Yet ignorance got all you internet dummies divided as Got him! Everything I talk about on this channel comes back to one issue. Failing to follow through on your ideas, your projects, your mission. If that's been your pattern, me and Romani Malco is hosting a live 90-minute workshop where we identify what's interfering with your follow through and connect your idea to the things that make it worth committing to. You trying to get that work? Link is in the description. If you came to this video thinking that you was lazy, unfocused, undisciplined, that you just didn't want it bad enough, I just showed you using actual science. That ain't what's happening. What's happening is your brain came with a default setting that shuts you down under stress. That's biology. Then you built a story around that shutdown that made it make sense to stay down. That's biography. Then the culture you was raised in reinforced that story and called it strength. That's sociology. How the hell we 3 layers deep and still ain't no cake? But here's where the science gets good. Remember the shock experiment? The ones who pressed the button and it actually worked, well, their brains got updated. Prefrontal cortex lit up, told the panic system to calm down. And from that point on, even in situations they never seen before, they moved like they had options. That update wasn't motivation. It wasn't discipline. It wasn't a podcast or a prayer. It was experience. One lived experience of what I do actually changed what happened to me, rewired the entire system. That's the prescription. Not just believe in yourself, not manifest it, not take a leap of faith, experience. If the Marine Corps boot camp taught me anything, it was to find comfort in discomfort, to relish in it. Controlled, guided, lived experiences that teach your nervous system a new truth. What you do still matters. Now raise your hand if you keep a promise to your job faster than you keep a promise to yourself. You set an alarm for a meeting with somebody who don't even like you. But that idea you had at 2 a.m., the one that made your chest light up, you'll ghost that shit like an ex you owe money to. So how do we install control? How do we learn control? Here's what the research actually says. Your prefrontal cortex don't care about your affirmations. It cares about one thing. Did what I just do change something? That's it. That's the software update. Your brain has to detect that your action produced a result. That detection is what shuts down the dorsal raphy nucleus. That's what tells the panic system to stand down. And here's the part that should piss you off. The research found that once that detection happens, it creates plasticity, meaning your prefrontal cortex physically changes. And that change carries over to brand new situations you ain't even faced yet. One experience of control starts protecting you from future shutdowns you haven't even encountered. So don't start with the dream, start with the dishes. Not because the dishes matter, but because your nervous system needs to register a completion loop. You said you was gonna do it, you did it. Your brain just got a receipt that the button works. Then you stack another one. Walk around the block at 7 a.m. because you told yourself you would. Write one sentence of that book. Update one line of that resume. The dogs didn't need to escape the whole building. They just needed to cross one wall. again and again and again. And then the researchers found that it took less and less force each time until the dog started initiating their own escape. That's how control gets installed. Not through some big breakthrough with crying and walking on hot coals and hugging strangers. Through small, boring, unsexy proof that what you do still changes what happens to you. And when you catch yourself saying, I always do this, or nothing ever works for me, that's the narrative on autopilot. That's you decorating the cage, picking out throw pillows for a prison you could stroll out of. Interrupt that shit. This is temporary. This is just this situation. This is what happened to me, not who I am. Now, if you want somebody to walk you through that process live, that's what my workshop is. Me and Romani Malco, 90 minutes, no incense, no affirmations taped to your steering wheel, just the awareness your nervous system been waiting on. Link in the description. And if you made it this far, send this to somebody who think they broken. They not broken, they just never got the update. And this next video might be the one that walks you into freedom.